Right now, as you are watching this, Tehran is burning, not metaphorically, literally. Oil depots are on fire across the Iranian capital, massive plumes of dark smoke visible from the highway, the sky turning orange as the United States and Israel have, over 9 days, conducted what amounts to the most consequential military operation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been assassinated, Iran's parliament building targeted, its state broadcaster struck, its navy and air force effectively dismantled, and Trump, standing before cameras, said that just about everything's been knocked out. But here is what the mainstream narrative isn't pressing hard enough. This war didn't erupt from nowhere. The strikes followed the failure of indirect US-Iran nuclear talks in early February 2026. Talks where Washington demanded Iran permanently end all uranium enrichment, surrender its ballistic missile program, and accept the timing of sanctions relief on Washington's terms. Iran said no. And 10 days later, the bombs fell. Now the world is watching Moscow. Russia has been providing Iran with intelligence on the locations of American warships and aircraft in the Middle East. The Kremlin convened emergency meetings, publicly condemned the attacks, but provided no material support to Tehran, despite holding a treaty on comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran signed just in January 2025. Russia is caught. Putin has been carefully warming ties with Washington, praising Trump's Ukraine mediation efforts, and Moscow is now weighing whether to defend a partner or protect a relationship. That calculation, right there, is the hinge point of what happens next in the global order. Let me think carefully about what you need to understand about the phrase hydra targets, because that phrase, that specific word hydra, is the analytical key that unlocks everything that's happening right now. In Greek mythology, the hydra was a serpent with multiple heads. You cut off one, two grow back. And that is precisely the strategic nightmare that American military planners have inherited in this war. When you remove a state's conventional deterrent, you do not produce a compliant state. You produce a state with every incentive to fight asymmetrically, indefinitely, and below the threshold of direct confrontation. That is what's unfolding in real time. Tehran is burning, yes, but the tentacles of Iran's power projection system are still very much alive, and in some cases, they are already reconstituting. The US and Israeli campaign has been built on effects-based operations, prioritizing strategic impact over simple body counts. US and Israeli forces now enjoy total air supremacy. B-52s and B-1 bombers operate unchallenged. After all, S-300 batteries and early warning radars were systematically destroyed. More than 300 Iranian ballistic launchers have been wiped out, cutting attack volume by 90%. These are genuinely remarkable military achievements, and I am not going to minimize them. From a purely kinetic standpoint, the campaign has performed efficiently. But here is where you need to slow down and think very carefully, because kinetic success and strategic success are not the same thing, and they never have been. Iraq taught us that, Libya taught us that, and now at enormous cost we may be learning it again. Proxy warfare remains the IRGC's most effective instrument for projecting power. Through Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, the Houthis, and networks in Syria and beyond, the IRGC maintains an expeditionary ecosystem capable of striking regional and global targets without exposing the Iranian state to direct retaliation. These groups operate within a shared strategic framework, but retain enough autonomy to complicate attribution, response planning, and escalation management. Now read that again carefully. These groups operate with enough autonomy to complicate attribution. That is not an accident. That is architectural design. The Iranians built this system over 40 years precisely so that it would survive a scenario like this one. Every proxy node is a semi-independent franchise. You can kill the franchisor, and the Americans very much have, but the franchisees continue operating. The IRGC-QF has directorates in countries across Asia, the Levant, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and the overall efficacy of the organization has never been entirely contingent on one individual. So when Washington tells you that the decapitation of Iran's leadership is a decisive blow, you have to weigh that against the structural reality, which is that this network was stress-tested against exactly these kinds of strikes and has demonstrated repeatedly that it reconstitutes. The Houthis are already resuming attacks on Red Sea shipping. Kataib Hezbollah is threatening US bases across Iraq. A Quds Force statement carried on Iranian television warned that it will soon target Americans within the homeland and abroad, saying the enemy should know that their happy days are over and they will no longer be safe anywhere in the world, not even in their own homes. These are not empty words from a defeated enemy. These are operational signals from a network that has prepositioned assets globally over decades. And now we come to the question that matters most to the broader picture of where the world is heading. What does Moscow do? Because Russia's position in all of this is genuinely extraordinary and deeply revealing of how power actually operates in the current global system as opposed to how it is presented in the mainstream media. While the Russian Foreign Ministry has condemned the US and Israeli operations repeatedly, Putin has kept conspicuously quiet, save for a message expressing condolences following the elimination of Iran's supreme leader, which labeled his killing a cynical murder, though refrained from mentioning the United States directly. That careful, measured silence is itself a geopolitical statement. It is a signal to Washington. We are watching, we are not moving, and we are not going to give you a reason to escalate toward us. Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership treaty with Iran in January 2025, but Russian officials were careful to stress at the time that this did not amount to a military alliance or a commitment to provide mutual military assistance. That carefully crafted language was deliberate. The Russians knew even then that the storm was coming. They had watched the military buildup in the region, they had processed the intelligence, and they structured their partnership with Iran in a way that gave them every symbolic benefit of the relationship: diplomatic leverage, military-industrial cooperation, geopolitical positioning, while leaving themselves a legal and operational exit ramp should the United States move decisively against Tehran. This is not weakness. This is the kind of patient, structured calculation that defines Russian statecraft at its most sophisticated. Russia's public posture in response to the military action against Iran has been one of sharp rhetorical condemnation. Moscow has labeled the strikes unprovoked acts of armed aggression and warned of regional and global instability unless diplomacy is restored. But Russia will obviously not enter into any kind of military confrontation with the US and Israel, nor has it sent Tehran the least sign that it may provide any form of support. The Kremlin's next steps will likely be calibrated to uphold its credibility as a counter-Western partner but avoid being drawn into a second high-intensity conflict, and this is the core tension. Russia needs to appear like Iran's protector and partner to maintain its global credibility among non-Western nations. But at the same time, Russia cannot afford to antagonize Trump at a moment when Ukraine peace talks remain on the table and Western sanctions continue to grind down the Russian economy. Years of grinding war in Ukraine have hollowed out Russia's capacity to project power beyond its borders. With its military overstretched and its economy under sustained pressure from Western sanctions, Moscow's influence in the Middle East is set to diminish further. But there is something else happening beneath the surface, something that the mainstream framing misses entirely. Russia may be quietly benefiting from this war in ways that will only become visible in retrospect. Oil prices surged to their highest levels since September 2023 because of the war, and anything that raises the price of oil is good for Putin. He is able to say, if you cannot get oil from the Gulf, we have a great supply. Every barrel of disrupted Gulf oil strengthens Russia's fiscal position. Every news cycle dominated by Tehran takes international pressure off of Ukraine. Every American interceptor missile expended over the skies of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia is one fewer missile potentially flowing to Kiev. The arithmetic here is straightforward, and Moscow's strategists understand it very well. In the short term, the conflict promises to deplete the US's already limited stockpile of air defense interceptors, threatening future supplies to Ukraine and leaving the country more vulnerable to Russian attacks. The surge in oil prices will also benefit Moscow, temporarily relieving some pressure on its war-strained budget, as will the prospect of a distracted US that will now have even less capacity to focus on the war in Ukraine and compel the Kremlin to agree to a negotiated peace. This is the lens through which you must read Russia's apparent passivity. It is not passivity at all. It is strategic opportunism dressed as restraint, and history tells us this is exactly how Russia operates when it cannot move overtly. It lets events do the work. But here is the deeper question. In the longer term, the most significant threat to Russia is that a new Iranian regime emerges from this conflict that reconsiders its partnership with Moscow. This would seriously diminish Russia's leverage and standing in the region, although it is far from clear that this war will induce a fundamental shift in government in Iran. This is the hidden gamble that Putin is running right now. If the United States succeeds in producing a genuinely new Iranian government, one that is Western-aligned, economically integrated with the Gulf states, and strategically cooperative with Washington, then Russia loses one of its most consequential bilateral relationships. It loses a military technology partner, an energy coordination partner, a sanction circumvention partner, and one of its primary levers of leverage over Gulf Arab states. That outcome would represent a genuine strategic defeat for Moscow, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. Russia's entire Middle East policy has been predicated on balancing and occasionally mediating between Iran and its adversaries. Its ties with Iran gave Russia leverage with Israel and the Gulf Arab states. With a new Iran, Russia could lose this role. That is the strategic nightmare scenario for the Kremlin, and it explains why Putin is now placing phone calls to Gulf leaders and presenting himself as a potential mediator. Putin told Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa that Moscow was ready to use all possibilities at hand to actively help stabilize the situation in the region. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said Russia could play a positive stabilizing role given its ties with both Tehran and Gulf capitals. This is Russia trying to remain relevant in the architecture of whatever comes next, positioning itself as the indispensable interlocutor regardless of whether the existing Iranian regime survives or is replaced. Now let us think about what the Americans are actually trying to achieve with this campaign, because the stated objective and the operational reality do not entirely align. Washington and Jerusalem share the same ultimate aim, neutralizing the Iranian threat, but their priorities differ. Under President Donald Trump, the United States seeks regime change. The goal is total: dismantle Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, sink its navy, block any path to nuclear weapons, and shatter the proxy network that has strangled the region for decades. Those are the publicly articulated objectives. But when you look at the structural reality of what is being struck, you see something important. The assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei produced a temporary council that continues to issue defiant orders. The regime is wounded, it is disoriented, it has lost enormous institutional capacity, but it has not collapsed. On March 3rd, a three-member transitional council was established, composed of the president, the head of the judiciary, and a jurist from the ruling Guardian Council, to temporarily fulfill the duties of the leader. That matters enormously, because the entire premise of the American strategy rests on the regime fracturing from within, on the IRGC leadership deciding that survival means accommodation, on the population rising up, on a coalition of pragmatists maneuvering toward a settlement. But despite significant losses at the senior level, the IRGC retained substantial institutional depth with an estimated 180,000 personnel. Losses at the senior level did not disrupt command continuity or operational capacity. The Basij, as a mass organization embedded in society, remained intact. The IRGC is not a command structure that dissolves when its top figures are killed. It is a deep, distributed institution with 180,000 personnel, embedded economic interests, embedded social infrastructure, and a paramilitary network that has been hardened through 40 years of sanctions, war, and external pressure. Since the US and Israel attacked Iran, more than 1,300 people there have been killed, according to the Iranian Red Crescent, including over 160 people in a strike on a girls' school. The United Nations Refugee Agency says about 100,000 people fled Tehran in the first 2 days of the attacks. This is the human dimension that gets lost in the strategic analysis, and it matters, not just morally, but strategically. When you kill civilians, when you bomb schools, when you displace hundreds of thousands of people from their capital city, you do not necessarily produce a population that rises up against its government. Historically, populations under foreign military attack tend to consolidate around their existing government, however much they may resent that government, because the external threat becomes more immediate than the internal grievance. The Americans appear to be banking on the Iranian population welcoming regime change, but the historical evidence for that assumption is thin, to say the least. During his 37 years in power, Khamenei pursued a foreign policy defined by an ideologically driven confrontation with the majority of Iran's neighbors, chief among them the Gulf states. A cornerstone of this policy was forming, funding, and weaponizing proxy networks in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and Gaza. These networks contributed to ideological polarization in the region, undermined state institutions, and featured terrorist acts targeting domestic opponents as well as Iran's regional and extra-regional foes. That is the architecture that the United States is trying to dismantle. And the question is not whether they can destroy its physical infrastructure. They clearly can, and they clearly are. The question is whether destroying physical infrastructure is sufficient to destroy an ideology, a network of human relationships, a 40-year project of regional power projection, and that is where serious analysts genuinely disagree. This latest assault on a key ally follows the humiliation of Putin's allies in the club of authoritarians, the spectacular collapse of the Assad regime, its key client ally in 2024, and Maduro's arrest by US forces in Venezuela in January. This time it is Iran, one of Russia's major partners and an independent actor, in the crosshairs. Iran is the ally that helped Russia adapt and even transform modern warfare by supplying Shahed drones. It is the ally that Russia proudly welcomed into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS Plus in 2024. Russia is watching its strategic environment contract at a remarkable pace. I.e., Assad gone, Maduro arrested, Khamenei assassinated. The informal network of states that constituted the backbone of Russia's global counter-Western coalition is being systematically dismantled, and Moscow is doing nothing to stop it, because Moscow cannot stop it without risking direct military confrontation with the United States. A confrontation that nobody in the Kremlin actually wants. The attack on Iran is a cause of concern in Moscow, but it is also seen as a vindication of its own geopolitical strategy, including the aggression against Ukraine. It is a confirmation of the Kremlin's long-held view of the US-led West as a rogue and irrational actor. That framing is important because it tells you how Russia will use this war domestically and internationally. Every Russian state television broadcast about Tehran is simultaneously a broadcast about why Russia was right to build its nuclear arsenal to the size it has. Every image of a burning Iranian city is presented to the Russian domestic audience as proof that only nuclear deterrence stands between Russia and the fate that has now befallen Iran. That narrative serves Putin's political interests enormously, and he will lean into it. It is highly likely that this support will continue in covert and hybrid forms while the active phase persists, and later through more open arms and technological supplies should a peace deal with the regime be reached. So Russia is not abandoning Iran, it is recalibrating its support to operate below the threshold of American detection and response, satellites, electronic warfare, intelligence sharing on ship and aircraft movements, sanctions circumvention channels. The visible Russia is standing aside. The invisible Russia is working quietly. This is how Moscow has always operated in conflicts it cannot dominate overtly. And now we come to where this is all heading, which is the question that matters most to every person watching this. The United States has committed itself to a military campaign aimed at producing regime change in one of the most institutionally resilient states in the Middle East. It is doing so while simultaneously managing an active conflict in Ukraine, deteriorating relationships with European allies, and a domestic political environment that does not have infinite tolerance for foreign military adventurism. The oil price spike is already hitting American consumers at the pump. Switzerland has already declared the attack constitutes a violation of international law. The UN Secretary-General described the strikes as squandering an opportunity for diplomacy. The moral and legal legitimacy architecture around this operation is fragmenting in real time, and the proxy network, the hydra, is already regenerating heads that the bombs cannot reach. The war tests Russia's strategic patience, ideological narrative, and capacity to maintain agency in a rapidly fragmenting region. The partnership of convenience that once served as a buffer is now a variable in a much larger equation, one where Russian influence is neither preeminent nor entirely optional. It is contingent, negotiated, and increasingly vulnerable to shifts far beyond Moscow's direct control. That is the honest assessment of Russia's position. Not a superpower confidently managing a great game, a major power under significant pressure, watching its strategic environment transform faster than it can adapt, making calculated bets that it can remain relevant in whatever order emerges from this destruction. Whether those bets pay off depends on something nobody can predict right now, which is what Iran looks like 6 months from today, and whether the state that emerges from these ruins is one that Russia can work with, or one that has been permanently reoriented toward Washington. That is the question that defines the next chapter of the global order. Not whether the bombs fall, they are already falling, but what rises from the rubble when they stop.